Grandma doesn't really come to Thanksgiving anymore. Mom says it's easier that way. I heard my granddaughter whisper those words through the half-open kitchen door while I stood outside, holding a pumpkin pie that was still warm in my hands. The cold November wind moved through the maple trees in Daniel's front yard, rattling the dry leaves across the driveway. But somehow that little girl's voice cut through everything else. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. I stood there in my wool coat with my casserole dish balanced against one hip, waiting for someone to laugh and correct her. Nobody did. The kitchen stayed quiet for 2 long seconds before Vanessa spoke in that soft, polished voice she used whenever she wanted to sound reasonable. "Sweetheart, Grandma gets emotional during holidays. We're just trying to keep things peaceful this year." Peaceful. That word settled into my chest heavier than the pie dish in my hands. I looked through the front window and saw the dining room table glowing under warm yellow light. My grandson Tyler was already wearing the paper turkey hat I'd mailed him last week. Vanessa's sister sat at the end of the table pouring wine. Daniel was carving the turkey in the kitchen island exactly the way his father used to. Everyone looked comfortable, complete, like a family photograph inside one of those Christmas catalogs that arrive too early every year. Only I wasn't in it anymore. I stepped backward before they noticed me standing there. My boots crunched softly against the frozen grass as I walked toward my car. The pumpkin pie fogged the windshield while I sat behind the steering wheel trying to understand what had just happened. Daniel had told me Thanksgiving dinner was canceled this year because Vanessa's side of the family had come down with the flu. He even sounded tired when he explained it over the phone 3 nights earlier. "Maybe we'll do something small after Christmas instead, Mom." I believed him. Of course I did. Mothers believe their children long after they should stop. I drove home slowly through the streets of Columbus while Christmas lights blinked across front porches and inflatable snowmen leaned sideways in front yards. Every radio station seemed to be playing holiday music already. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the pie beside me had gone cold. The house felt exactly the way it had felt every evening since Harold died 11 months ago. Too quiet, too large, too still. His recliner remained beside the fireplace with the folded newspaper still tucked into the side pocket. Some mornings I still caught myself listening for his footsteps upstairs. Grief does strange things to silence. It stretches it until even the refrigerator humming in the kitchen sounds lonely. I carried the pie inside and set it on the counter without taking off my coat. Then I looked at my phone. No missed calls. No texts. Nothing from Daniel asking where I was. Nothing from the grandchildren. I told myself maybe Vanessa truly thought she was protecting the atmosphere. Maybe they assumed I'd be too sad after Harold's first Thanksgiving gone. Maybe there was some explanation that didn't leave me feeling like someone had quietly erased my name from the family Bible. I called Daniel anyway. Straight to voicemail. "Hi, honey," I said after the beep, trying to keep my voice light. "Just checking in. Happy Thanksgiving. Call me when you get a minute." I hung up and stared at the kitchen window above the sink. My reflection looked older lately. Not weaker exactly, just faded around the edges. Like one of those photographs left too long in sunlight. 10 minutes later, I called again. Voicemail. Then again an hour after that. By midnight, I had called 11 times. Each voicemail sounded calmer than the last. That was the strange thing. The more invisible I felt, the quieter I became. Around 1 in the morning, I finally sat down at the kitchen table and listened to the old wall clock ticking beside the pantry. Harold had bought that clock during our 2nd year of marriage from a little antique shop outside Cincinnati. "Solid oak lasts forever," he used to say whenever he wound it every Sunday evening. I glanced at the family photo hanging near the hallway. Last Thanksgiving. Harold still alive. Daniel standing beside me with one arm around my shoulders. Vanessa smiling perfectly into the camera. The grandchildren sitting cross-legged on the rug. I remembered how Vanessa insisted on posting that picture online immediately after dessert. "Perfect family memories," she'd captioned it. I suddenly realized something that made my stomach tighten. I hadn't seen that photograph anywhere online lately. I opened Facebook with trembling fingers and scrolled through Vanessa's profile. New Christmas decorations. Tyler's soccer photos. A birthday dinner from September. Then I found last Thanksgiving's album. My breath caught. Every single picture had been updated, cropped, reframed. In the family portrait hanging on my own wall, I stood between Daniel and Harold smiling beside the turkey platter. But online, the version Vanessa posted no longer showed me at all. The image had been trimmed neatly at the shoulders, so the family looked smaller, cleaner, as if I had never been sitting there in the first place. The next morning, snow covered the neighborhood in a thin white layer that made everything look quieter than usual. I woke up in Harold's side of the bed again without meaning to. That had become a habit over the past few months. Sometimes grief moved you without asking permission first. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me while weak November sunlight pushed through the curtains. For a few seconds I forgot about the photographs. Then it all came rushing back at once. The cropped images, Vanessa's voice in the kitchen, the sound of my granddaughter whispering that holidays were easier without me there. I sat up slowly and reached for my glasses on the nightstand. My phone rested beside them. Still nothing from Daniel. No missed calls. No text messages saying they had been busy cooking or entertaining guests. No apology. Just silence. The kind of silence that does not happen by accident. I walked downstairs wrapped in Harold's old gray cardigan and started the coffee maker. The kitchen smelled faintly like cinnamon from the pie I had left untouched on the counter overnight. The whipped cream had melted into a pale puddle along the edge of the plate. I threw it away quietly and rinsed the dish in the sink while the house creaked around me. 29 years in this home, and I could recognize every sound it made in winter. The heater clicking on, the loose board near the pantry, the soft tapping noise from the maple branch outside Harold always promised to trim before spring. Some mornings those sounds comforted me. That morning they only made the emptiness feel larger. I carried my coffee into the living room and opened Facebook again even though I knew I should not. I scrolled through Thanksgiving photos from the night before. Vanessa had uploaded more sometime after midnight. Tyler grinning beside the turkey. Her sister laughing near the fireplace. Daniel holding a wine glass while everyone gathered around the table. The comments underneath made my chest tighten. Beautiful family. Perfect Thanksgiving. So glad everyone could make it. Everyone. I stared at that word for a long time. Then I noticed something else. In one picture, the dining room table looked shorter than usual because the chair at the far end had been removed completely. My chair. The seat Harold always saved for me nearest the kitchen because my knees bothered me during long dinners. Vanessa had not only erased me from the photographs, she had physically removed my place from the table itself. I set the phone down carefully and looked around the room. Harold used to say there was a difference between being alone and being unwanted. One is life, he told me once after his brother moved to Arizona. The other one cuts deeper. At the time I thought he was only talking about old age. Now I understood what he meant. Around 10 that morning I called Daniel again. Straight to voicemail. I waited an hour and tried once more. Same result. By noon I stopped leaving messages and simply listened to his recorded greeting before the beep interrupted me. Hey, you have reached Daniel Whitmore. Leave a message and I will get back to you as soon as I can. His voice sounded cheerful, relaxed, like someone who still had a full family around him. I finally hung up without speaking. The clock above the fireplace ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, snow slid slowly from the roof of the garage. Somewhere down the street children were laughing while they built snowmen in their front yards. Life continued so normally around me that it almost felt cruel. I decided to drive to the grocery store just to hear other human voices. The cashier at Kroger smiled kindly when she saw the single microwave dinner in my cart beside a carton of milk and cat food. Looks like somebody is taking it easy after Thanksgiving, she joked lightly. I smiled back because older women learn how to smile through almost anything. On my way out, I noticed Christmas decorations already stacked near the entrance. Red ribbons, artificial wreaths, boxes of ornaments. Harold loved Christmas more than anyone I had ever known. Every year he woke up before sunrise the day after Thanksgiving and covered the house in white lights while Frank Sinatra played from the garage radio. Daniel used to help him string lights across the porch roof when he was little. I remembered standing in the yard holding extension cords while both of them laughed every time Harold nearly slipped off the ladder. For years I thought memories like that glued families together permanently. I see now that memories only matter when everyone agrees to keep carrying them. When I got home, there was finally a text message waiting for me. My heart jumped before I opened it. But it was not from Daniel. It was from Vanessa. Sorry we missed your calls yesterday. Things got hectic here. Hope you had a peaceful Thanksgiving. That was all. No invitation. No explanation. Not even a question asking where I had been. Just a neat little sentence carefully polished to sound polite while saying absolutely nothing. I read it 3 times before setting the phone face down on the kitchen table. Then, for the first time since Harold died, I realized something terrifying. I had spent almost an entire year believing I was grieving the loss of my husband. But sitting there alone in that silent kitchen, I began to understand I might also be grieving the slow disappearance of my family. Once you start noticing the pattern, it becomes impossible to stop seeing it. That was the hardest part. Not the loneliness itself. Not even the silence after my phone calls. It was the realization that the signs had been there for years, scattered quietly through birthdays and family dinners like breadcrumbs I had refused to follow. A week after Thanksgiving, I found myself standing in the laundry room folding towels when the memory of Emma's 6th birthday suddenly came back to me so clearly that I had to sit down. Vanessa had called me the night before that party, sounding flustered and apologetic. We had to change the venue last minute, she told me. The indoor play place was overbooked, and we are scrambling trying to reorganize everything. She promised Daniel would text me the new address in the morning. No text ever came. I spent nearly 2 hours sitting by my phone that Saturday waiting for details before finally calling Daniel myself. He sounded distracted when he answered. Music and children laughing filled the background behind him. "Mom, where are you?" he asked. I remember staring at the kitchen clock while confusion spread slowly through me. I thought Vanessa was sending me the new location. There was a pause on the line before his voice softened into that uncomfortable tone people use when they do not want conflict. I thought she already did. Later that evening, Vanessa called, sounding horrified by the misunderstanding. "Oh my goodness, Margaret, I am so embarrassed. Everything was so chaotic today." I told her it was fine. I even laughed lightly to make her feel better. Looking back now, I realized something important. Vanessa never excluded me loudly. She excluded me politely. That was what made it so difficult to explain to anyone else. There were never screaming arguments or cruel confrontations. Just tiny disappearances, tiny omissions, tiny moments designed carefully enough to look accidental. Another memory surfaced while I stood at the sink washing dishes that same afternoon. 2 summers earlier, Daniel and Vanessa hosted a 4th of July barbecue at their house. I arrived carrying homemade potato salad only to find everyone already eating dessert. Vanessa looked genuinely startled to see me. "Margaret, I thought you said you were not feeling well today." I remember blinking at her in confusion. I never said that. She pressed one manicured hand lightly against her chest. "Oh dear. Then I must have mixed you up with my Aunt Carol." Daniel barely looked up from the grill while she spoke. At the time I convinced myself it was harmless. A misunderstanding. But now those moments lined up one after another inside my mind with frightening precision. The missing invitations. The changed plans. The forgotten phone calls. Even Harold noticed it toward the end of his life. One evening after Christmas dinner last year, he sat quietly in his recliner while Vanessa loaded leftovers into containers for everyone except us. I remember him watching silently for a long moment before leaning toward me once we got home. "Does it feel different to you lately?" he asked quietly. I pretended not to understand what he meant. "What does?" He stared out the living room window for several seconds before answering. "The way they include us. Or maybe the way they do not." I defended them immediately. I said young families were busy now. I said times had changed. I said Vanessa was under stress balancing work and motherhood. Harold only nodded slowly, but the sadness in his eyes stayed with me long after that conversation ended. 3 days later, I drove to the pharmacy to refill my blood pressure medication. The cashier near the front register recognized me because Harold and I had gone there for years. "How are the grandkids doing?" she asked while handing me my receipt. Such a simple question should not hurt as much as it did. I smiled automatically and said they were growing fast. Then I walked back to my car feeling strangely exhausted. The truth was I had not seen Emma or Tyler in nearly 7 weeks outside of photographs online. Their birthdays, soccer games, school recitals. Somehow I always found out afterward, never beforehand. That evening snow fell heavily across Columbus, coating the sidewalks in thick white layers while Christmas lights blinked through the darkness. I sat alone at the kitchen table sorting old family photographs into albums because I could not bear another night staring at my phone. One picture stopped me completely. Daniel at age 9, standing beside Harold in front of a crooked little snowman. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his smile stretched so wide it nearly closed his eyes. I remembered exactly what happened after that photograph was taken. Daniel ran inside crying because his mittens were soaked through, and Harold wrapped both of his hands around a mug of hot chocolate to warm them. "Family takes care of each other," Harold whispered to him that night while I tucked him into bed. I sat there holding that old photograph while the storm thickened outside my windows. Somewhere along the way, those lessons disappeared. Or maybe they only applied when Harold was alive to hold everyone together. My phone buzzed suddenly against the table, making me jump. For one hopeful second, I thought it might finally be Daniel. But it was a notification from social media instead. Vanessa had posted new Christmas family portraits online. Matching sweaters, smiling children, warm lights glowing behind them. I stared at the photographs carefully until my chest tightened again. Every member of the family stood together in front of the fireplace holding mugs of cocoa. Even Vanessa's parents were there. But directly beside the tree stood an empty space large enough for one more person. It looked almost intentional, almost like someone had been edited out after the picture was taken. The week before Christmas, I decided to stop waiting for invitations that were never going to come. That realization settled over me quietly one Tuesday morning while I stood in the grocery store parking lot watching snow collect on the hood of my car. I had just finished buying gifts for the grandchildren out of habit more than hope. Tyler wanted a telescope for Christmas because he had become fascinated with planets after a science project at school. Emma loved drawing, so I bought her a large art set with colored pencils and sketchbooks packed neatly inside a wooden case. I stood there holding those shopping bags while cold wind pushed against my coat, and for the first time it occurred to me that I had no idea whether I would even see them open those gifts. The thought followed me home like a shadow. Inside the house, I placed the presents beneath the Christmas tree Harold and I had decorated together every year since Daniel was 5 years old. The ornaments looked older now somehow, more fragile. Harold's favorite glass cardinal hung near the center branch beside the handmade clay ornament Daniel made in second grade. I touched it gently and remembered how proud he had been bringing it home from school with bright red paint smeared all over his little fingers. "Do not let Mom touch it yet," he told Harold that afternoon. "It still needs to dry." I could still hear his little voice so clearly sometimes that it startled me. That evening I wrapped the grandchildren's presents carefully using silver paper and blue ribbon. I even wrote little notes for each of them in my neatest handwriting. But when I finished, I did not place any tags with my name on the gifts. I simply stared at them sitting beneath the tree while something painful settled into my chest. A terrible question. Would Vanessa even tell the children the gifts came from me? The next afternoon, I drove past Daniel's neighborhood on my way home from the pharmacy. Their street glowed with Christmas lights hanging from rooftops and wrapped around mailboxes. Inflatable snowmen bounced gently in front yards while giant wreaths hung from nearly every door. As I turned the corner near their house, I slowed instinctively. Daniel's driveway was full of cars. Vanessa's parents were there. Her sister's SUV too. Through the front windows, I could see people moving around the dining room carrying plates and laughing together. Christmas music drifted faintly through the cold air each time the front door opened. I sat at the stop sign longer than necessary watching shadows move behind those warm golden windows. Then I saw Emma. She ran toward the front door, wearing little reindeer pajamas, while Vanessa followed behind her, holding a tray of cookies. Daniel appeared a moment later carrying firewood toward the garage. For one foolish second, I almost rolled down my window and called his name. But something stopped me. Maybe pride, maybe exhaustion, or maybe the growing understanding that I was no longer expected inside that house unless someone needed something from me. I drove away before anyone noticed my car. Later that night, my phone rang unexpectedly while I was washing dishes. My heart jumped so hard I nearly dropped the plate in my hands. Daniel's name flashed across the screen. I answered immediately. "Hi, honey." His voice sounded distracted and slightly rushed. "Hey, Mom. Sorry I have been hard to reach lately. Things have just been crazy around here." I leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping the phone tightly. "I understand." There was a short silence before he spoke again. "Listen, I wanted to ask you something. Do you still have the paperwork from Dad's old cabin insurance policy?" The words landed heavily between us. Not because of what he asked, because of what he did not ask. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not mention Thanksgiving. He did not explain why I had not seen my grandchildren in nearly 2 months. He called because he needed paperwork. I closed my eyes briefly. "I think so." "What?" "The bank needs updated documents before the refinance goes through. Vanessa thought maybe you had copies stored somewhere." Vanessa thought. Of course she did. Harold bought that cabin 30 years ago near Lake Hope State Park. Every summer Daniel spent weekends fishing there with his father. After Harold died, ownership transferred partly through my trust because Harold wanted me protected financially no matter what happened. Suddenly something cold moved through my chest. Not grief this time. Clarity. Daniel kept talking while I stared out the kitchen window into the dark backyard. The lender wants everything processed before New Year's if possible. I spoke slowly. You never mentioned refinancing the cabin. Another silence. Longer this time. We have been considering turning it into a vacation rental property, just for extra income. I looked around the empty kitchen, the old clock ticking beside the pantry, Harold's coffee mug still sitting in the cabinet exactly where he left it. Every holiday memory in this house suddenly felt connected to that cabin somehow. Daniel learning to fish, Emma roasting marshmallows beside the lake, Tyler falling asleep in Harold's lap during thunderstorms. Family. That word used to mean permanence to me. Now it sounded transactional, useful only while assets were involved. I will look for the paperwork tomorrow, I said quietly. Daniel sounded relieved immediately. Thanks, Mom. I appreciate it. Then the line went silent again for half a second before he added casually, oh, and Merry Christmas if I do not talk to you before then. If I do not talk to you before then. I stood motionless in the kitchen long after the call ended. Snow drifted softly outside the window while Christmas lights from neighboring houses blinked across the darkness. Somewhere in another part of town, my family sat together drinking cocoa beside a fireplace. And for the first time since Harold died, I stopped asking myself why they were pushing me away. I already knew the answer. They still wanted access to everything Harold and I built together. They just no longer wanted me attached to it. The morning after Daniel called about the cabin paperwork, I drove out to Lake Hope for the first time since Harold's funeral. Snow lined the narrow roads leading through the state park, and the frozen lake stretched gray and silent beneath the winter sky. Harold always loved this place most during December. Summer shows off, he used to say while standing on the dock with coffee steaming in his hands. Winter tells the truth. Back then I thought he was talking about nature. Now I wondered if he had been talking about people too. The cabin sat exactly as we left it after Labor Day. Brown shutters, stone chimney, the little wooden swing Harold built 20 years ago still hanging crookedly on the porch. I unlocked the front door slowly and stepped inside. The familiar scent of cedar wood and old fireplace ash wrapped around me instantly. For a moment, I could almost hear Tyler racing down the hallway or Emma laughing while Harold taught her card games at the kitchen table. Family memories lived loudly in this cabin. Maybe that was why Daniel wanted it so badly. I turned on the lights and walked toward the filing cabinet Harold kept in the small office near the back bedroom. Snow tapped softly against the windows while I searched through folders labeled insurance, taxes, utilities, and trust documents. Harold organized everything carefully after his first heart scare 6 years earlier. If something happens to me, you should never have to guess where anything is, he told me one night while sorting paperwork at the dining room table. I found the refinance information faster than expected. But something else caught my attention too. A thick envelope labeled in Harold's handwriting. Margaret protection file. My fingers froze against the folder. Harold never used dramatic language unless something truly mattered to him. Slowly, I sat down in the office chair and opened it. Inside were copies of legal documents from the trust, handwritten notes, bank statements, and a letter folded neatly at the center. The date at the top showed Harold wrote it only 3 months before he died. Margaret, if you are reading this, then something in your gut already feels wrong. I stopped breathing for a moment. Snow continued falling outside while the cabin creaked softly around me. Harold's handwriting slanted slightly to the left the way it always did when he was tired. I kept reading. Daniel is my son, and I love him. But I have watched Vanessa separate him from you little by little for years now. She does it quietly enough that nobody else notices. Sometimes I think Daniel notices too and chooses silence because it is easier than conflict. I stared at those words until they blurred slightly. Harold saw it. All of it. Long before I allowed myself to admit it. The letter continued. If there ever comes a time when you feel pushed aside after I am gone, do not let guilt convince you to surrender what we built together. People reveal their true priorities when they think a widow is too lonely to resist them. My chest tightened painfully. I could hear Harold's voice in every sentence. Calm, steady, protective even after death. At the bottom of the folder sat another document I had completely forgotten existed. The trust amendment. Harold revised it the same year Tyler was born. According to the paperwork, ownership of the cabin could not be refinanced, sold, or transferred without my direct approval as primary trustee. Not Daniel's. Mine. Suddenly, the urgency in Daniel's phone call made perfect sense. They needed my signature. I leaned back slowly in the office chair while snow drifted heavily outside the windows. Something inside me shifted quietly then. Not anger exactly. Clarity. For almost a year, I had been grieving like someone abandoned, waiting beside silent phones, hoping for invitations, explaining away every humiliation because loneliness makes you desperate to preserve whatever scraps of family remain. But sitting there in that little cabin office, surrounded by Harold's careful preparation, I realized something important. Harold did not leave me helpless. He left me protected. My phone buzzed against the desk suddenly. Vanessa's name appeared across the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Margaret," she said brightly, her voice polished as always. "Daniel mentioned you might be looking for the insurance documents today. Not how are you doing. Not did you make it safely through the snow. Straight to business." I glanced out the office window toward the frozen lake. "I found some paperwork." Her tone warmed immediately. "Wonderful. The lender is really pushing for everything before the end of the month. We are trying to move quickly. Everything was always we when money or property entered the conversation." "I see," I said quietly. There was a small pause before she continued carefully. "Daniel worries about you managing all this alone, especially after Harold. We thought refinancing would help simplify things for everyone long term." Simplify things. Such gentle words for something that suddenly felt much larger underneath. I looked around the cabin office again. Harold's fishing hat still hanging on the wall. The old family board games stacked near the closet. 40 years of marriage stored inside these rooms. Vanessa kept talking while I listened silently. Maybe after the holidays we could all come up together for a weekend. The children missed the cabin. Not me. The cabin. I noticed the difference immediately. "That sounds nice," I replied softly. But for the first time in months, I no longer sounded desperate to be included. Because finally, painfully, I understood the truth. They had spent nearly a year removing me emotionally from the family, while quietly keeping themselves attached to everything Harold left behind. And now that I could see it clearly, something inside me stopped breaking. Christmas arrived 3 days later under a sky so gray it almost looked metallic. Snow covered the sidewalks in soft, untouched layers, and every house on my street glowed with colored lights and wreaths hanging neatly on front doors. For most of my life, Christmas morning began with noise. Daniel racing downstairs before sunrise. Harold pretending to complain while secretly loving every minute of it. Wrapping paper scattered across the carpet. Bacon frying in the kitchen while Frank Sinatra played softly from the stereo. But that morning the only sound inside my house came from the heater humming through the vents and the old wall clock ticking beside the pantry. I woke before dawn out of habit and sat quietly at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee warming my hands. The gifts for Emma and Tyler still sat untouched beneath the tree exactly where I had left them. Around 8 o'clock my phone buzzed. For one foolish second my heart still reacted the old way. Hopeful. Automatic. But it was only a group text from Vanessa sent to several relatives at once. "Merry Christmas" from the Whitmores, followed by a photograph of everyone standing in matching pajamas beside a massive tree overflowing with presents. Daniel smiled with one arm around Vanessa's shoulders while the children grinned into the camera, holding candy canes. Even Vanessa's parents were there wearing matching red sweaters. I stared at the photograph for a long time before setting the phone face down on the table. Not because the picture hurt anymore. Strangely, it did not. What hurt was realizing how carefully they had normalized my absence. No one in that room appeared uncomfortable that I was missing. No empty chair. No mention of me. Just a complete family portrait that functioned perfectly without Harold or me inside it. Around noon, I drove to St. Andrew's Church for the community Christmas luncheon Harold and I used to volunteer at every year. The fellowship hall smelled like baked ham, cinnamon rolls, and fresh coffee when I walked inside. Elderly couples sat together near folding tables covered with green plastic tablecloths, while volunteers carried trays of food back and forth from the kitchen. "Margaret," Mrs. Collins called the moment she saw me near the doorway. She hurried over wearing a bright green scarf and wrapped me in a warm hug before I could even respond. "We have missed you these past few months." Such a simple sentence nearly brought tears to my eyes because it carried something I had not felt in a very long time. Genuine welcome, not obligation, not politeness, presence. I spent most of the afternoon helping serve mashed potatoes and pie slices beside two retired teachers from Dayton. Nobody asked awkward questions about why I was alone. Nobody forced cheerful sympathy onto me because Harold had passed away. They simply treated me like someone who belonged there. At one point, I noticed an older man sitting by himself near the far wall, slowly eating turkey while staring at the floor. Without thinking, I carried him an extra slice of pie and sat beside him for a few minutes. His wife died the previous spring. His children lived in Arizona and Seattle. "Holidays feel louder when you are alone," he said quietly while folding his napkin. I nodded because I understood exactly what he meant. That evening, as I prepared to leave, Mrs. Collins handed me a small tin wrapped in ribbon. "Some leftover cookies for you," she said warmly. "And we hope you come back next Sunday too. The choir misses your voice." I smiled all the way to the parking lot holding that little tin against my coat. It struck me then how starved I had become for ordinary kindness. When I returned home, darkness had already settled across the neighborhood. I turned on the tree lights and stood quietly in the living room watching soft reflections flicker across the windows. Then my phone rang unexpectedly. Daniel again. I answered calmly this time. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he said quickly over background noise and children shouting somewhere behind him. "Merry Christmas, honey. Sorry things have been hectic today. We have everybody over." Everybody. The word no longer surprised me. "I understand." There was a short pause before his voice lowered slightly. "Did you happen to find those refinance documents yet?" I closed my eyes briefly. "Of course. Even on Christmas Day?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I found them." His tone brightened immediately. "That is great. Vanessa has been stressing about the lender deadline all week." I looked toward Harold's recliner near the fireplace while Daniel kept talking about paperwork and appraisal schedules. The contrast suddenly felt almost surreal. On one side of town, strangers at a church luncheon remembered my favorite pie and asked me to sing with the choir. On the other side, my own son called on Christmas only to discuss property documents. Something inside me finally settled into place then. Not bitterness, not rage, just acceptance. I waited until Daniel stopped talking before speaking again. "I am not signing anything yet." Silence filled the line instantly. Even the background noise seemed farther away now. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. I sat down slowly on the couch beside the Christmas tree. "I mean the cabin stays exactly the way your father intended until I decide otherwise." Another long pause followed. Then Daniel sighed softly in the way people do when conversations become inconvenient. "Mom, we are only trying to make things easier for everyone." Easier. Such a familiar word. Vanessa always used it when excluding me from family dinners. Easier not to travel. Easier to keep things small. Easier if I stayed home. I stared at the glowing tree lights while snow drifted softly beyond the windows. "Funny," I said quietly. "That is exactly what Vanessa told Emma about holidays too." The silence on the other end became so heavy I could almost hear Daniel stop breathing. Daniel did not call again for 4 days after our Christmas conversation. Neither did Vanessa. The silence between us felt different now, though. Before, it had felt like abandonment. Now it felt strategic, like both sides suddenly understood something had shifted. On the Friday after Christmas, I woke early to freezing rain tapping against the bedroom windows. The weather forecast warned people to stay off the roads unless absolutely necessary, but I still drove downtown that morning for an appointment with Harold's attorney, Martin Keller. His office overlooked the Scioto River from the 6th floor of an old brick building near Broad Street. Harold trusted Martin for nearly 20 years. A good lawyer should speak less and notice more, he always said after meetings. Sitting in Martin's waiting room that morning, I realized Harold had spent far more time preparing for my future than I ever understood while he was alive. Martin greeted me warmly the moment I stepped into his office. "Margaret," he said softly while shaking my hand. "You look stronger than the last time I saw you." The comment surprised me because I had not felt strong at all these past months. Mostly tired. But perhaps there is a difference between looking wounded and finally seeing clearly. I handed him the folder Harold left in the cabin office. Martin adjusted his glasses and slowly reviewed the documents while rain streaked across the windows behind him. At one point, he nodded quietly to himself, as though confirming something he already suspected. Harold was very thorough, he said after several minutes. He anticipated potential pressure regarding the cabin and other assets. Pressure. Such a careful professional word for what my family had become. Martin folded his hands on the desk and looked directly at me. Margaret, as primary trustee, you are under no obligation to refinance, transfer, or surrender any property. Legally speaking, everything remains entirely under your control unless you choose otherwise. I stared down at my hands resting in my lap. For months, I had felt like a guest lingering too long in my own life. Hearing those words felt strangely grounding. Harold thought this might happen, I said quietly. Martin's expression softened. He loved your son deeply. But toward the end, he became concerned that you were slowly being isolated. Isolated. The truth sounded colder spoken out loud. Martin opened another folder from his desk drawer and slid several documents toward me. There is something else you should know. I adjusted my glasses and looked down at the paperwork. Bank records, annual transfers, payment summaries. My stomach tightened slowly as I read. For the past 4 years, Harold and I had quietly contributed nearly $1,800 every month toward Daniel and Vanessa's expenses. Mortgage assistance, school tuition support, property taxes on the cabin, even part of Vanessa's graduate school loans years earlier. I looked up slowly. I knew we helped sometimes. I did not realize it was this much. Martin nodded carefully. Harold wanted family support handled discreetly. He believed dignity mattered. Dignity. Another word that suddenly carried more weight now. I thought about every missed birthday, every ignored phone call, every holiday where my chair quietly disappeared from the table while our money continued flowing steadily into their lives. Something inside me did not break this time. It hardened, not cruelly, calmly, like water turning to ice overnight. Martin continued speaking gently while I stared at the payment records. Margaret, loneliness often convinces widows to tolerate emotional neglect because they fear losing connection entirely. Harold worried you might sacrifice too much just to remain included. I swallowed slowly because the truth of that sentence hurt more than I expected. He was right. Every time Vanessa excluded me, I worked harder to stay close. I bought thoughtful gifts, sent cards, called first, apologized for inconveniences I never caused. Somewhere along the way, I started behaving less like a mother and more like someone requesting permission to remain visible. After the meeting ended, I drove home through icy streets feeling strangely calm. The world outside looked frozen solid beneath gray winter skies. Bare trees, salt-covered roads, thin smoke curling from chimneys across quiet neighborhoods. Winter tells the truth. Harold's words returned to me again. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed with another message from Vanessa. Hi, Margaret. Just checking whether you sent those refinance forms yet. The lender is asking again. No greeting. No warmth. No mention of Christmas. I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone aside without answering. Then I walked into the living room and stood beside the Christmas tree still glowing softly in the corner. Beneath it sat the untouched presents for Emma and Tyler. I suddenly realized something painful. The gifts were not really for the children anymore. They were for me. Proof that I still existed in their lives somehow. Proof that I still belonged somewhere in that family photograph. Slowly, I bent down and picked up both presents from beneath the tree. The silver wrapping paper reflected softly against the colored lights while I carried them toward the hallway closet. Not angrily, not dramatically, quietly. That was the moment everything truly changed. Because for the first time since Harold died, I stopped chasing people who had already decided to leave me behind. And the silence that followed no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. January arrived with bitter cold and long stretches of gray sky that made every afternoon feel like early evening. Snow piled along the sidewalks in stiff frozen ridges, while people hurried between buildings with their heads down and scarves wrapped tightly around their faces. Normally, winter always felt lonely after the holidays ended. But that year, something inside me had shifted enough that the silence no longer frightened me. It simply revealed things more clearly. I stopped checking my phone every morning expecting messages that never came. I stopped opening social media looking for photographs where I had already been erased. And strangely, once I stopped reaching toward people who had withdrawn from me, I began noticing the people who quietly moved closer instead. Every Wednesday afternoon, I started helping at St. Andrew's Community Pantry, sorting canned goods and winter coats for seniors living alone. Most of them were widows. Some had children who visited occasionally. Others had not seen family in years. Yet sitting beside them folding donated blankets or pouring coffee into paper cups never felt heavy the way sitting alone in my kitchen once did. One woman named Evelyn told me she spent every Christmas eating frozen dinners by herself after her daughter moved to Oregon. But she still wore bright lipstick every Sunday because, in her words, loneliness should never be allowed to decide what kind of woman I become. I thought about that sentence often afterward. One snowy afternoon after volunteer work, I returned home to find Daniel's truck parked in my driveway unexpectedly. He stood near the front porch with his hands buried inside his coat pockets while snow drifted around him. For a moment, he looked almost like the boy who used to wait for Harold to come home from work. Nervous, uncertain, but when I stepped out of my car, his eyes immediately shifted toward the house instead of meeting mine directly. "Mom," he said quietly, "what are you doing here?" The question escaped before I could stop it. A strange expression crossed his face. "I came to check on you." "Check on me." Such careful wording. I unlocked the front door and let him inside. The house smelled faintly like coffee and cinnamon candles, while soft jazz played quietly from the kitchen radio. Daniel looked around the living room slowly, almost surprised everything remained exactly as it always had. Harold's recliner, the framed family photographs, the blankets folded neatly beside the couch. "You redecorated," he said after noticing the dining room table. I glanced toward it. Instead of holiday decorations, several boxes of donated scarves and gloves sat organized near the center. "Church donations," I explained. "We are preparing winter packages for seniors this weekend." Daniel nodded absent-mindedly while his eyes wandered toward the hallway closet where the grandchildren's Christmas presents remained hidden inside. I could almost see him searching for signs of loneliness, signs of weakness, signs that I might still be waiting for my family to return emotionally the way abandoned people often do. Instead, he found a woman calmly continuing her life without them. We sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee while snow tapped softly against the windows. For several minutes, Daniel talked mostly about work stress and interest rates and how expensive everything had become lately. Not once did he mention Thanksgiving, or Christmas, or the many months where I barely existed in his daily life. Finally, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "Vanessa is worried the refinance delay might cause problems with the lender." There it was, the real reason for the visit. I stirred cream slowly into my coffee without answering immediately. "I met with Martin Keller last week," I said calmly. Daniel's shoulders stiffened almost instantly. "Why?" "Because Harold asked him to protect my interests after his death." Silence settled heavily between us. Daniel stared down at his coffee mug while snow continued falling outside the kitchen window. "Mom," he began carefully, "nobody is trying to take advantage of you." I looked at him quietly for several seconds. His hair had started graying near the temples lately. Harold's same broad shoulders. Harold's same tired eyes whenever conflict appeared. But somewhere along the way, my son learned to confuse avoidance with kindness. "Do you know what hurts most?" I asked softly. Daniel finally looked up at me then. "It is not the cabin. It is not the paperwork. It is realizing your father died nearly a year ago, and somehow I disappeared with him." His expression tightened immediately. "That is not fair, is it not?" I asked gently. "When was the last time Emma called me herself? Or Tyler? When was the last holiday where I was expected instead of tolerated?" Daniel rubbed one hand across his face slowly. "Vanessa just thought you needed space after Dad." Space. Such a familiar excuse. "No," I replied quietly. "Vanessa needed space. There is a difference." He did not answer. Because somewhere underneath all his silence, I think Daniel knew it too. The kitchen clock ticked steadily while we sat there across from each other. Finally he spoke again, but his voice sounded smaller this time. "The kids do miss you." I nodded slowly. "Then they are welcome to visit me." Another silence followed. I could almost see him realizing this conversation was no longer happening on his terms. For the first time in nearly a year, I was not asking to be included. I was setting boundaries instead. Daniel finished his coffee quietly before standing near the doorway to leave. "I will talk to Vanessa," he said softly while pulling on his coat. But even he did not sound convinced. I walked him to the front porch where cold wind carried snowflakes across the yard in slow spirals. Before stepping toward his truck, Daniel hesitated briefly. "You seem different lately." I looked past him toward the frozen street lined with bare trees and glowing porch lights. "I am," I said calmly. "Your father spent 42 years teaching me what love looks like. Once you understand that, it becomes very difficult to accept anything less." By early February, the snow around Columbus had started melting into dirty gray piles along the curbs, and the sharp edge of winter slowly softened into something quieter. The mornings still carried a bitter chill, but sunlight lingered a little longer each evening across the neighborhood. Life moved forward the way it always does, even after families fracture in ways nobody else can see. I spent more time at St. Andrew's than I did at home now. Every Thursday afternoon, the fellowship hall filled with widows, retired couples, and people who simply did not want to eat alone anymore. We served soup, coffee, and sandwiches while volunteers moved between tables laughing softly beneath strings of warm yellow lights. At first I joined because I needed distraction from grief. Somewhere along the way, it became something else entirely. It became belonging. One Thursday evening after cleanup, Mrs. Collins handed me a stack of handwritten invitation cards tied together with blue ribbon. "We are organizing a community dinner for seniors next month," she explained. "People loved your idea about memory tables." I looked down at the cards in surprise. A few weeks earlier, I casually suggested decorating tables with framed family photographs so nobody would feel invisible sitting alone. Apparently, the idea stayed with people. "You should host it," Mrs. Collins said warmly. "You have a gift for making lonely people feel seen." The sentence followed me all the way home that night. Because for nearly a year, I believed losing my family meant losing my purpose too. But purpose has a strange way of returning once you stop begging for love from people unwilling to give it freely. 2 days later, my phone rang while I stood in the kitchen slicing apples for a pie. Daniel again. His voice sounded unusually tense from the moment I answered. "Mom, can we come by tomorrow?" I paused with the knife still in my hand. "Who is we?" Silence flickered briefly through the line. "Me. Vanessa. The kids." The kids. Not once in months had he offered to bring them over until now. I looked through the kitchen window toward the backyard where late afternoon sunlight stretched across melting snow. "All right," I said calmly. "Tomorrow afternoon is fine." After we hung up, I stood there quietly for several seconds. A year ago, that phone call would have filled me with relief, hope, gratitude. But now I understood timing differently. Families do not suddenly rediscover love the moment financial paperwork becomes complicated. Sunday afternoon arrived cold and windy. I baked cinnamon rolls that morning mostly because the house smelled warmer with something in the oven. Around 2 o'clock, Daniel's SUV pulled into the driveway. Emma jumped out first wearing a pink winter coat, while Tyler followed carrying his tablet under one arm. For a brief moment, seeing them again hit me so hard emotionally that I had to steady myself against the kitchen counter. Emma ran toward me the second I opened the front door. "Grandma," she shouted while wrapping her small arms around my waist. I closed my eyes tightly against the sudden sting behind them. Children love honestly before adults teach them otherwise. "Look how tall you are," I whispered while smoothing her hair gently. Tyler hugged me next, quieter than his sister, but warm all the same. Behind them, Daniel and Vanessa stepped into the house, carrying polite smiles and careful tension between them. Vanessa glanced around the living room almost immediately, measuring, observing, looking for signs. But there was nothing left for her to measure anymore. The desperation she once depended on was gone. We sat together in the dining room while the children ate cinnamon rolls and talked excitedly about school projects. For the first half hour, everything remained painfully polite. Vanessa complimented the curtains. Daniel asked about church volunteer work. Nobody mentioned the cabin. Nobody mentioned the distance between us. But avoidance has limits. Eventually, Vanessa folded her napkin carefully beside her plate and cleared her throat softly. "Margaret, we wanted to apologize if you ever felt excluded these past few months." Felt excluded. Such careful language. Like loneliness had merely been a misunderstanding instead of a pattern. I looked at her calmly across the table. "I did not feel excluded," I replied quietly. "I was excluded." Silence settled instantly over the room. Even the children stopped talking for a moment. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Vanessa forced a small smile that never reached her eyes. "That was never our intention," she said quickly. I glanced toward the framed family photograph hanging near the hallway entrance. The last Christmas before Harold died. Everyone gathered together beside the tree. "Intentions become less important when behavior repeats itself for years," I said softly. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the table. Vanessa remained very still. Then Emma spoke suddenly, in the innocent, straightforward way only children can. "Mom said holidays were easier because Grandma cried after Grandpa died." The room went completely silent. Vanessa's face drained of color almost instantly. "Emma," she whispered sharply. "But the damage was already done." I looked at my granddaughter gently. "Thank you for telling the truth, sweetheart." No anger rose inside me then. Only clarity. Pure and complete. Daniel rubbed one hand slowly across his forehead, while shame settled visibly across his face for the first time in months. Vanessa stared down at her untouched coffee cup. And suddenly I understood something important. They expected me to explode eventually. To cry. To accuse. To become emotional enough that they could dismiss my pain as grief or bitterness. But peace unsettles guilty people far more than anger ever will. I stood slowly from the table and walked toward the hallway closet. Then I returned carrying the wrapped Christmas presents that had sat hidden there untouched for weeks. Emma's eyes widened immediately. "Grandma kept our gifts?" she asked softly. "Of course I did," I replied while handing them over. Then I looked directly at Daniel and Vanessa one final time. "Family is not measured by who finds you convenient during happy moments," I said quietly. "It is measured by who stays when life becomes uncomfortable." Nobody answered me. Outside, late winter sunlight glowed softly across the melting snow while silence settled around the table like truth finally arriving where it belonged.